In this video, we're going to talk about demand. Demand in economics is defined to be the relationship that exists between the price of a good and the quantity of the good demanded in a given time period, ceteris paribus. The term ceteris paribus is one we're going to be using over and over again throughout this course. It means holding other things constant. We use that so we can simplify a complex reality and focus on the things that are most essential for our analysis. When we represent a demand relationship, we're just looking at how the price of the good affects the quantity demanded, holding constant anything else that might affect the quantity that you would buy. One way of representing a demand relationship is with a demand schedule. This is an example now on the screen. What we observe here is as the price of the good goes up, the quantity demanded at each price goes down. That's a relationship that we'll talk about more in just a few minutes. We can also represent exactly that same demand relationship by a demand curve, which is just a graphical depiction of the same information. Or we could use a demand equation, which again captures exactly that same relationship. If you plug numbers for price into this equation, you'd see that it would match the quantities demanded on this diagram. For example, when the price is 1, quantity demanded would be equal to 120 minus 20 times 1, or just 100, which is a point corresponding to a price of 1 on this diagram, and so forth. No matter how we illustrate this, the demand relationship that we just represented involves an inverse relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. That's a concept in economics that's so pervasive that we refer to it as the law of demand. That simply states, as the price of a good goes up, people buy less, holding everything else constant in a given time period. There's two basic reasons for this law of demand. One reason for this is the substitution effect, which just tells us as a good becomes more expensive, it's now more expensive relative to anything else that we might have bought for the same purpose. In response to that, we'll buy more of alternatives. For example, in New York City, if the price of a taxi goes up or an Uber goes up, then people might be more likely to use subways. If subways became more expensive, people might be more likely to use buses and so forth. If the price of beef goes up, people might be more likely to consume chicken or pork or soy products. The substitution effect tells us that when something becomes more expensive, we buy less of it and we replace it with other things that satisfy similar needs. The other effect is the income effect, which is simply that when something becomes more expensive, you can't afford as much of it as you did before. So in a sense, the substitution effect involves a reduction in your willingness to pay for a good, and the income effect involves a reduction in your ability to pay for the good. So when a good becomes more expensive, you're less willing to pay for it, which is the substitution effect, and you're also less able to pay for it, which is the income effect. Both of those effects for most goods will result in a reduction in the quantity of the good demanded when it becomes more expensive. Now, one source of confusion that students always have when they first study demand is the difference between a change in quantity demanded and a change in demand. A change in quantity demanded occurs when you change the price of the good. In this example, if the price of this good goes up, the quantity that people buy goes down. That's not a reduction in demand. Demand is not a point on the curve. Demand is a whole curve itself. So there'd be a change in demand only if the demand curve changes. So the main point is, a change in price affects the quantity demanded, but it doesn't affect demand because that whole relationship is demand. For demand to change, the demand curve would have to shift. In the diagram that's now on the right, we see the demand curve has shifted to the right. That would be an example of an increase in demand because at any given price now, people buy more of the good. So a change in price involves a movement along a curve and affects only the quantity demanded. A change in demand occurs if the whole curve shifts. Remember, we said when we drew the demand curve, it was a relationship between price and quantity demanded, ceteris paribus. When the demand curve shifts, it's because One of those things we held constant is now no longer constant and has changed. One thing we should look at is how we go from individual demand to a market demand. Here we're going to take a really simple case where there's two people in a market. There's person A and person B. I'm not feeling very creative right now. And what happens is we have the demand curves for person A and B. At a price of $3, person A buys 10 units of the good. Person B buys, looks like 13 units of the good. So together, person A and B would buy a total of 23 units of the good, which is what's illustrated as a point on the market demand curve. To get the market demand curve, we just add up at each price the quantities demanded by each person, and that's what the market represents. Now, in general, we're going to have more than two people in a market, but the same concept applies. The market demand is nothing more than the horizontal summation, where we add up the quantities for all the demand curves for all the people in that market. The factors that shift demand we call determinants of demand. These are the primary determinants of demand: changes in tastes and preferences, changes in prices of related goods and services, income, the number of consumers, and expectations of future prices and income. If there's a fad, people now are more likely to buy a good than they were before. And as a result, fads increase the demand for the goods that suddenly become more popular. In terms of prices of related goods, there's two ways in which goods could be related. One way is that they could be substitutes. Two goods are defined to be substitutes in an economic sense if an increase in the price of one results in an increase in the demand for the other. Two goods are defined to be complements if an increase in the price of one results in a decrease in the demand for the other. That's a formal definition in economics. Intuitively, goods are substitutes if they tend to be used in place of each other. Goods are complements if they tend to be used together. So substitute goods would be things like the examples we talked about before with subways and taxis, for example. Complements are goods that tend to be consumed together. Peanut butter and jelly might be an example, or coffee and donuts might be complementary goods. When we consider changes in the prices of substitute goods, it's a good way of illustrating the distinction between a change in quantity demanded and a change in demand. If the price of coffee goes up, that represents, in the left-hand portion of this diagram, a change in the quantity of coffee demanded, because we're only changing the price of the good itself. Nothing else has changed. So that's a change in quantity demanded. So we move along the demand curve. But if coffee becomes more expensive, that will affect the demand for all the goods that are substitutes or complements for coffee. In this case, tea is very likely to be a substitute good for coffee. So when coffee becomes more expensive, people will consume more tea at each and every given price, which means the demand curve for tea will increase, and therefore it shifts to the right, as illustrated in this diagram. Now let's take that example of peanut butter and jelly. If the price of peanut butter goes up, that affects the quantity of peanut butter demanded, as illustrated in the diagram. But if peanut butter costs more, people will consume fewer peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, which will lead to a reduction in the demand for jelly. So think through these examples. It's a good way of seeing the difference between a change in quantity demanded and a change in demand. It's really confusing at first, but when the price of a good changes, we're moving along a demand curve and we're not shifting it if we're dealing with that same good. A change in the price of one good, though, will affect the demand for any substitute or complementary good. Another factor that affects demand is income. Most goods are normal goods, where demand goes up when income rises. We call them normal goods because that's the most common situation. So with normal goods, when people get more income, they buy more of most of the things you tend to buy. There are some goods, though, that we call inferior goods. And inferior goods are goods where you buy less when income goes up. Used cars, used clothing might both be examples of inferior goods. Spam or potted meat food product might be other examples of inferior goods, where people with higher incomes tend to consume less of those. For some people, fast food meals might be inferior goods. For others, they might be normal goods. The key point is what happens empirically. When people get more income, do they buy more? If so, it's a normal good, or do they buy less? In which case, it's an inferior good. Now, going back to the market demand, remember the market consists of the sum of the demand of all the individual consumers. If there's an increase in the number of buyers, we're adding more people to that mix, and the sum of the quantity demanded is always going to be greater. And therefore, when there's more people in the market, demand will rise. We should also talk about the effect of expectations of the future. There's two types of expectations that matter. One is expected future prices. The other is expected future income. If the expected future price goes up, you're thinking about buying something and you acquire new information that makes you think it's going to cost more in the future, you're likely to rush out and buy it now. So when people expect prices to go up in the future, current demand rises. For example, if there's some instability in the Middle East, which may increase oil prices, people are likely to rush out and buy gas before the price goes up. Alternatively, if people think that something's going to be going on sale in the future, current demand will go down. So if people expect prices to drop, they'd rather wait until they can get the lower price later. If people expect higher income in the future, they're likely to buy more things now. But if people expect their income to go down in the future, they're likely to cut back on goods that they can postpone. So if you're thinking about buying a new car, but it looks like the economy is going into a recession and you might lose your job, you might very well decide to postpone that purchase. In the next video, we're going to talk about supply. And in the following one, we'll put demand and supply together and talk about the equilibrium.